Welcome to Olivia's True Infidelity Stories. I stood before my bedroom mirror, the thin straps of my summer dress slipping through my fingers. The late afternoon sun, a wash of gold through the blinds, couldn't hold my attention. My mind was fixed on the task of preparing dinner, anticipating the moment my stepson would come in from the garden, where he'd undertaken the repair of the broken trellis, a task he'd begun without my request. Attempting to adjust the bra beneath, my normally dexterous hands felt clumsy as I wrestled with the clasp of the dress strap. Then, just when I thought I'd secured it, the other clasp gave way, and the dress slid down, pooling at my waist. For a disorienting moment, I was frozen, staring at my reflection, just me, lace, and the honeyed light of the sun. It was then that a soft knock echoed from the doorway. "Dinner smells amazing," Ben said. "Do you need—" I turned sharply, clutching the fallen dress to my chest. My stepson, Ben, stood framed in the doorway, his gaze lingering a beat too long before he looked away, his eyes tight with a breathlessness. "I'm so sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," I responded, the heat in my cheeks betraying the calm in my voice. The door, I realized, must have been slightly ajar. He nodded, taking a step back, the air between us suddenly thick with an unspoken tension, and then disappeared down the hall. I stood there, gripping the fabric of my dress, heart pounding with a confusing mix of familiarity and unease. At 52, a widow for nearly 5 years, this sprawling house, once a symbol of my security, now felt vast, echoing with a silence that only emphasized my solitude. My late husband, Jason, had left me with every comfort, every material thing that one could desire, but also with an emptiness that settled into each room, each mundane chore. And then there's Ben, his son from his first marriage. He's 27 now, tall, possessing a quiet confidence that's both endearing and infuriating. When Jason passed, Ben insisted on remaining a part of my life, his grief a mirror of my own, his hand warm in mine at the funeral. Over the years, he's been my lifeline, helping with the things Jason would have done, fixing a fence, clearing the gutters, carrying heavy boxes from the basement. Our interactions had fallen into an easy rhythm, his presence a balm to my chronic loneliness. But lately, there'd been a change. I'd noticed the way his eyes would linger a fraction too long when I handed him a glass of iced tea, the way he stood closer than necessary when we looked through old family albums. I'd dismissed it as simply my imagination, a lonely heart playing tricks. But what happened at the door, the hitch in his voice, the flush on his cheek, I was starting to wonder if it was something more. At dinner that night, a tension filled the air, an unspoken acknowledgement between us. He sat across the table from me, tanned forearms resting on the edge as he complimented the roast chicken, and I found it difficult to concentrate. I couldn't shake the image of him at the doorway, his eyes widening, then quickly averting his gaze, as if he'd seen something forbidden, something he was both drawn to and afraid of. The odd thing was, instead of the outrage or embarrassment I should have felt, I only felt a strange, unwelcome heat rising in my chest, stirring sensations I hadn't experienced in years. As I sipped my wine, I caught him sneaking glances at me, his gaze quickly dropping to his plate when we made eye contact. For the first time, I felt a shift in our dynamic. It was no longer just me observing him, he was noticing me. After dinner, he volunteered to do the dishes. From the living room, I watched him move, the steady rhythm of water and the clinking of dishes a lullaby. His broad shoulders stretched against his tiche, as he leaned over the sink, and for a moment I was lost. I forgot that I was a woman who had helped raise him. I forgot the decades that separated us. I forgot that this was wrong. The moment he turned off the faucet, his gaze meeting mine, my heart skipped a beat. His lips parted slightly, and a deep, seated feeling told me this was the start of something new. The next morning, while I was pouring coffee, the back door's creak announced Ben's arrival. "Morning," he called, his voice still thick with sleep. He stood in the doorway, his hair tousled, t-shirt clinging to his chest, a toolbox in hand. "Morning," I replied, my voice betraying my quickened pulse. "Figured I'd tackle the back fence before it gets too hot," he said, stepping inside, bringing with him the faint scent of earth and pine. "Coffee," I offered. He rewarded me with that disarming, lopsided smile. "Sure, black please." As he took the mug, our fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through me. Our eyes met, and the charged air between us held that moment. The day unfolded in fragments of these moments. Later, I found myself watching him work on the fence, captivated by his broad shoulders and the flex of his muscles. I chided myself for staring, but his quiet confidence was hard to ignore. When he caught me looking, I quickly turned away, my heart pounding. After he finished, I brought out lemonade. As we sat together, he said, "Looks like you fixed it," nodding to the fence. "Only because I had such a good excuse to come over," he replied, his playful tone hiding the intensity in his eyes. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. That night, his voice, his smile, his lingering gaze replayed in my mind. I tried to dismiss it, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that this was more than just friendly interaction. A few days later, he appeared again, the toolbox a silent promise of more time spent. "Thought I'd take a look at the deck," he said, though we both knew it didn't need fixing. The summer heat was oppressive, and we shared iced tea. "You know," he said quietly, "I think this is the first summer I've really spent time here with you." A warmth bloomed within me. "I'm glad you're here, Ben. I really am." For a fleeting moment, we felt like the only two in the world. Over the following weeks, his visits became routine. He'd find reasons to be close, fixing small things, each interaction deepening into more personal conversations. He shared his past, and then, looking at me, said, "It didn't take long for me to realize how lucky he was to have found you." His words disarmed me, and when he reached out, brushing my hand, everything melted away. On the porch swing, a bottle of wine stood between us, fueling a light conversation at first, reminiscing about Jason, sharing stories of Ben's college days. But as the wine flowed, so did the unspoken words we'd both been holding back. "I never told you this," Ben began, his voice a near whisper, "but after Dad passed, I didn't just come to help. I needed to be here with you." His confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My breath hitched, and I was momentarily speechless. When I finally began to respond, he cut me off with a shake of his head. "I know it's wrong," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I know how this looks, but I can't ignore what I feel." He then recalled a turning point, a rainy afternoon when he brought over a new garden hose. The sudden downpour trapped us inside. In the living room, with a movie playing unheard in the background, he broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" I asked, my voice barely audible, "about us." My heart skipped a beat. "Then we can't." I started, but he reached out, his fingers brushing mine. "Why not?" he asked, his voice low and steady, his gaze unwavering. "We're not hurting anyone. It's just us here in this moment. Why can't we have that?" His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but I couldn't because deep down I wanted it too. Before I could respond, he leaned in, gently cupping my face as his lips brushed mine. It was a soft, tentative kiss, a test, but I didn't pull away. The kiss deepened, and for a moment the world disappeared. No rain, no judgment, no past or future, just us. When we finally broke apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I couldn't stop myself. I shook my head, my hands trembling as they rested on his chest. "Don't be." We sat in comfortable silence, the rain a constant rhythm outside. By the time it stopped, something had fundamentally shifted between us. There was no going back. The next evening, Ben arrived unannounced. It was unusual, even for him. I was still processing our encounter from the day before, and seeing him once again, with a determined look in his eyes, made my pulse race. "I needed to see you," he said simply, his voice steady, yet tinged with a raw undercurrent. My hand hovered on the door frame, indecisive. "Maybe we should talk about," he began, closing the distance, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "We've been avoiding this, haven't we? For weeks, for months, and I think we both know where this is going." I wanted to protest, to push him away, to declare it wrong, but his words, heavy and truthful, hung in the air. "Let me in," he murmured, not demanding but pleading, and I found myself stepping aside, granting him entry, not just into the room, but into a previously guarded part of myself. We ended up in the living room. The space, once vast and empty, now felt small and thick with unspoken tension. He perched on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees, leaning forward. "I know this isn't easy for you," he started, his voice slow and deliberate, "but I can't keep pretending that what I feel isn't real, and I don't think you can either. Ben," I whispered, but the word caught in my throat. He stood, erasing the space between us. His hand brushed a stray hair from my face, the tenderness of the gesture making me catch my breath. "You're beautiful," he breathed, his voice barely audible. Before I could react, I leaned into his touch. And like that, the dam broke. His lips met mine in a kiss that was anything but hesitant. It was a slow, deliberate exploration, a culmination of everything we had left unsaid. His hands rested gently on my hips, holding me in place, as if afraid I might disappear. When we parted, my breath came in shallow gasps, my mind racing with the potential for mistakes. But then I looked into his eyes, soft, genuine, filled with an emotion I hadn't felt in years. "I don't want to stop," he said, his voice firm, and I realized I didn't either. We moved to the couch, the outside world fading into a distant hum. The whirring of the ceiling fan and the occasional creak of the floorboards became the soundtrack to our intimacy. He kissed me again, a deeper kiss this time, his hands sliding up my arm, igniting a fire that spread through me. I pulled back, resting my forehead against his. "This is crazy," I whispered. "Maybe," he replied, his fingers tracing patterns on my back. "But it feels right," and undeniably it did, too right. His hands moved lower, gripping my waist as he pulled me closer. A soft gasp escaped me, my body betraying the caution my mind had tried to enforce. My hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice strained, his eyes searching mine. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned in, my lips meeting his in an answer that was both affirmative and a surrender. The following moments became a blur, the gentle touch of his fingers against my skin, the way his lips found every place that made me shiver, the hushed words of reassurance in the dim light. It felt surreal, as if I was lost in a dream I never wanted to wake from. Time slowed as we surrendered to the pull that had been building for so long. Each touch, each kiss, each whispered word felt like a piece of a puzzle finally settling into place. When it was over, we lay together on the couch, bathed in the soft glow of the lamp. He had an arm draped around my waist, and I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath. "I don't regret this," he said quietly, breaking the silence. I looked up at him, my heart a complex mix of relief and uncertainty. I echoed his admission, the words a paradox of liberation and fear. The ensuing silence was a harsh reminder of reality. Our actions were irreversible. While the moment had felt right, questions now plagued my mind. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He held me tighter, his thumb tracing soothing circles on my hip. "We'll figure it out together," he said, his confidence reassuring but not enough to quell my apprehension. We had transgressed boundaries, and I couldn't pretend those lines hadn't been crossed. Yet, for the first time in years, I felt a spark of life. Morning rays filtered through the curtains, painting golden patterns on the living room floor. I sat on the edge of the couch, still wrapped in the blanket he'd given me. The house was quiet, except for birdsong, but my mind buzzed. Jason had left before sunrise, a lingering kiss, a promise of future talks. I watched him disappear into the dawn, taking with him the euphoria of the night before. The light of day brought a stark reality. My coffee grew cold as I traced the rim of the mug, swirling between the tenderness of his touch and the weight of what we had done. I had crossed a line I'd meticulously maintained, and yet I felt no regret. I had, for the first time in what seemed like an age, felt truly seen and desired. Jason had looked at me not as someone bound to him by obligation, but as a woman, one with desires, fears, and longings buried under grief and routine. However, one question loomed over me, as elusive as sleep had been the night before. I couldn't ignore the magnitude of what had happened. Whispers of doubt and judgment gnawed at me. I considered the life Ben and I had created, the remnants that still lingered in every corner of the house. What would he think? And Jason, what consequences would this have for him, for us? I placed the mug on the table, my hands shaking. The future was unclear, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. A week passed before I saw Jason again, a week spent alternating between moments of clarity and waves of doubt. I'd kept busy, gardening, organizing, even painting, anything to avoid dwelling on that night. But nothing could erase the memory of his touch, his intense gaze, the softened tone of his voice when he said my name. When he appeared on my porch that Saturday, my heart both soared and sank. He looked different, composed, but a tension in his shoulders hinted at the gravity of his visit. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me, he admitted, his hands in his pockets. I invited him in, my voice steady despite the inner turmoil. Of course I want to see you. He stepped inside, and we stood in silence for a moment, a silence heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke. I've thought about that night, about us, every day since, he said, his words measured but firm. I know it's complicated. I know it's unexpected, but I can't ignore how I feel about you. I don't want to. His honesty took my breath away. I'd been so preoccupied with guessing myself, imagining every possible consequence, that I hadn't truly allowed myself to consider the possibility of embracing this, of embracing him. I'm scared. I confessed, my voice a mere whisper. So am I. He replied, moving closer. But I'd rather be scared with you than wonder for the rest of my life what might have been. The silence that followed his words felt heavy, and within that pause, a change occurred deep within me. Later, as I escorted him to the door, his hand paused on the knob before he turned back. Come with me, he declared abruptly. Come with you, where? I asked, surprised. Anywhere, he replied, his gaze unwavering. Let's leave all this behind, start fresh together. I hesitated, thoughts and uncertainties battling in my mind. Yet, looking at him, at the hope shining in his eyes and the quiet strength in his tone, a tiny spark of something long dormant ignited within me possibility. I'll think about it, I managed, a hesitant smile forming on my lips. And as he departed, I couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, this was the dawn of a new chapter, one I hadn't even imagined.